Mega Evolution. The gimmick introduced in Gen 6 that would go on to land so well with the Pokémon fanbase, it would be included in 4 consecutive Pokémon games as a central mechanic in the competitive meta. It birthed its own entire timeline in the Pokémon universe. It added very interesting lore to legacy fan-favorite Pokémon like Rayquaza. It enabled the developers to come up with amazing, hyper-stylized designs for already fully evolved Pokémon, but then it was removed in Gen 8. Despite attempts to recapture this magic with new gimmicks like Z-moves and Gigantamaxing, none of them quite landed or generated hype in the same way that Megas did in the mid-2010s. And now it's finally returning in Gen 9's Legends game after a 7-year absence, as we revisit the Kalos region for a new story. Megas are a really obvious example of a generational gimmick, but there are so many more, from Gen 2's shinies and Pokémon eggs, Gen 3's double battles and weather effects, to modern ones like, of course, Gen 9's terastallizing. So where do Pokemon go from here as we move into the Switch 2 era? What new gimmicks can they introduce in Gen 10 to make it feel unique, to appeal to fans, and to bring something refreshing to the franchise? In this video, we're going to break down some big clues we've already had and some very plausible ideas that could land in the Gen 10 games. Hit that subscribe button if you enjoy, and if you want to support the channel whilst gaining access to custom emojis, livestream perks, members-only content, and having your name featured in videos, hit that join button and become a part of the Galarian gang. So the main gimmick I think we could see in Gen 10 is Synchro Shift. I think we might have had an actual tease for this in Scarlet and Violet, and I still think it's something we could see in Legends EA. In fact, I think we kind of are seeing a watered down version of it in Legends EA based on what we've seen of the game so far. Let me explain. Synchro Shift is the evolution of Battle Bond and the Synchro Machine. Way back in Gen 6, we had a special form of Greninja introduced that combined with Ash to create a new, more powerful form. You could use Ash Greninja in Gen 7, but as of Gen 9, it was fully removed from the game, and what the Battle Bond ability actually does was totally changed. I think this decision was made in preparation for bringing back this gimmick for more Pokemon in a more meaningful way. Gen 9 may have removed Ash Greninja, but it did introduce the Synchro Machine in the DLC, allowing you to control your Pokemon and explore the Blueberry Terrarium. Whilst in my last video, I did criticize the overall limited animations and behavior of the Pokemon in Gen 9, you have to give credit where it's due that all 715 Pokemon programmed into the Scarlet and Violet games were usable and did have various unique ways of moving, with Pokemon like Suicune and Lugia providing amazing throwbacks to the title screens of their own games, and Pokemon like Joltik bouncing around like the little jumping spider pal that he is. The great thing about Synchro Shift would be that it has overworld map uses as well as being a battle gimmick. The Synchro Machine will have taken a decent effort from the animators and developers in general, and was a really cool feature for them to add. But we all know they can take this further. Firstly, not restricted to use in one single terrarium, but the whole Gen 10 map. And secondly, expanding what you can actually do whilst controlling your Pokemon. In Scarvy, you can basically run around the map and auto-battle Pokemon with a quick scuffle animation, but they could take this much further, reinforcing a unique set of capabilities for each species of Pokemon. Firstly, allow us to manually battle with the Pokemon moveset, much like we see in the Legends EA battle system. But secondly, allow us to explore the map in unique ways, depending on what exact Pokemon we're using, and allow each Pokemon to enable unique access to otherwise hard to find items, Easter eggs, hidden quests and battles. We see glimpses of this uniqueness with Suicune running on the water and such, but Game Freak could create a way more complex, layered world map that's not limited to a few simple functions like swimming, flying and running. For example, different flying Pokemon could have different altitudes that they can get to, like Zubat, who's only used to fluttering around caves near floor level for example, can't reach the same height off the ground compared to a real high soaring Pokemon like Salamence or Skarmory. Then maybe the only way to access Pokemon that submerge themselves deeply underwater, like Tentacle, could only be accessible if you have a Pokemon that can actually dive, like Pelipper or an actual fish Pokemon. Digging Pokemon don't just uncover items that are buried underground like Ursaluna does in Legends Arceus, but some Dugtrio and Bunnelby can actually go deep underground and find otherwise inaccessible caves, items and underground areas. Again, with each unique Pokemon that's capable of digging, able to get to different depths for example. For the overworld, it's basically just a far more layered HM system that works in harmony with a big complex map, plays into the unique Pokemon Pokédex entries and characteristics of Pokémon species and doesn't just bunch them together by things like type or even field type. Hindsight is a wonderful thing, and I suppose the natural progression from HMs was ride Pokémon, and this would be the next step from that. Pokémon have nearly had a decade's experience of developing for home console now, so it's about time we see something like this. When I see how changeable and interactable the world is in upcoming Switch 2 games like Donkey Kong Bonanza, I have faith that Pokémon can pull something like this off. But here's where it gets even more exciting. Using the Pokémon and achieving certain milestones in Synchro mode with your Pokémon on the map would contribute towards a Synchro level bar of sorts that kind of represents a type of friendship meter, which, once full, would allow you to Synchro Shift in battle. Some Pokémon could have exclusive Synchro forms. What that Synchro form looks like could be very unique. For example, if the Synchro form was based on our playable character in the same way that Ash Greninja was based on Ash, maybe we'd have some level of control as to what the Synchro form looks like, at least with some of the more accent features, like taking inspiration from our hairstyle like Ash Greninja did with Ash. Or instead, if that's a bit too ambitious to program, you could have exclusive Synchro forms based on other characters and their bonds with their Pokémon. We've seen hints of this idea, like Lusamine when she combines with Nihilego, although that was kind of against her will. Trainers and their aces are a big part of the Pokémon world, Pikachu and Ash being the first obvious example, but also Giovanni and Mewtwo, N and Zoroark, Guzma and Golisopod. This unique trainer and Pokémon bond has clearly been on Pokémon's mind over the last few years, with sync pairs in Masters EX and even the recent Journey Together TCG set. Maybe then, the forms would be based on a variety of trainers, and you'd have to complete some sort of multiversal quests in-game to unlock the ability to use the unique bond form of a Pokémon with a different trainer. The ability for the player to customize their trainer in a huge variety of ways in Gens 6 to 9 does perhaps make this a little bit more difficult to execute if they want to create Synchro forms based on the player and keep that customization feature. But perhaps they could just base any Synchro forms with the protagonist off their base forms, if you like, i.e. the unedited official artwork versions of Florian and Juliana or Calum and Serena, for example. And they could limit the player's Synchro forms to just a handful of starters and maybe a few others, with the rest being exclusive to other trainers, but still being accessible to the player through quests. But between Ride Pokémon, Battle Bond, the Synchro Machine, and even Mega Evolution itself, I think it's definitely the sort of thing that would be both tempting for the Pokémon company to fully realize in a real definite way, and a gimmick like this could work so well. And what's great is that all Pokémon could experience the benefit from this, even if only certain Pokémon had the special bond forms. Just like how Pokémon that didn't have Gigantamax forms could still Dynamax, or how every Pokémon is technically able to Terastallize or use Z moves. So, especially after seeing the way the trainer is able to move around in real time during battle, dodging and timing attacks in ZA, I think Synchro Shift is one of our main culprits for the main gimmick of Gen 10. Along with the main glossy gimmick of each Pokémon generation, there also come less glossy ones, but those often have a really big effect on the franchise. Again, Gen 2 introduced shinies and Pokémon eggs, Gen 3 introduced weather systems and Pokémon abilities, and in more recent games, Gens 8 and 9 introduced things like craftable TMs and Let's Go mode. And this next one would be more like a successor to Totem and Alpha Pokémon introduced in Gen 7 and 8 respectively, but something that we as the player could actually use, and that is level overclocking. Whilst this one perhaps wouldn't be as glossy and earth-shattering as Mega Evolution or something like Synchro Shift, it would be a very cool gimmick to challenge one of the fundamental mechanics we've experienced in every Pokemon generation since Gen 1. Every Pokemon is a certain level based on the experience it gets in battle. The more experience points you get, the more you level up. But of course, that stops at 100. But what if Pokemon could tap into something? Maybe the dormant DNA of their ancestors, or some sort of godlike energy to temporarily break the matrix and overclock their level. Pokerogue is an example of a very fun game which actually doesn't have a level cap at all. You can get your Pokemon to level 100,000 if you want to, and that works well for the roguelike game genre, but I'm not suggesting that at all for the main series. Here, I think you're looking more at how you'd overclock a PC component. You push the hardware to its limit safely, achieving a 10 or 20% power boost, which then gives that boost to the Pokemon stats as well. This could be like a secret extra training opportunity you unlock once you get a Pokemon to level 100, creating 10 or 20 more hidden levels that only come into effect if you undergo an overclock in battle. I don't think this would necessarily require a full form change, but you could see a visual difference, a size increase, some sort of aura around the Pokemon, or even just simply an exaggerated expression change. Just something to signify that this Pokemon is overclocked in battle. Then again, when you think about the boss battles that Pokemon have introduced in recent times, firstly on the more extreme side, like Ultra Necrozma or Eternamax Eternatus, but also the smaller scale ones, like the Alpha and Totem Pokemon, Raid Pokemon, and even the Starmobile fights, we've already seen similar things to this, boosting stats by optimizing the Pokemon even further, but often they are actually not accessible by the player. This would be a way to give the player access to that, unlocking that extra little bit of dormant power in your Pokemon in a way that's not through Mega Evolution, and I suppose you could have new forms for this for some Pokemon. Going over level 100 would seem like a taboo, a fundamental rule of Pokemon broken, challenging what we know and what we're used to. And here's another one for you. Having more than 6 Pokemon on your person at any one time. In Scarlet and Violet, Sword and Shield, and Sun and Moon, you do have access to extra Pokemon, except they're strictly there to be ridden as a vehicle to help you bypass obstacles or lurking in your Pokedex as a sort of sentience. But Pokemon has never allowed you to actually use more than 6 Pokemon in battle. This is mainly, at its core, a mechanic to help balance the game and implement a rule set and level of expectation. But it's a very interesting thought exercise to think about why this rule would be in place in the Pokemon universe from a lore perspective. Like, how it's actually enforced and why almost everybody you meet abides by it. There are some instances in games where this rule is broken, and this is normally just when chaos ensues. In clips we see of the 3,000-year-old war in X and Y, large groups of different Pokemon are seen attacking each other without any respect for the rule of 6. In Team Star's bases, grunts team up against you, sending out 3 Pokemon each but creating a total of more than 6 to defeat at one time. And some bosses like Greavil in XD Gale of Darkness and Volo in Legends Arceus break this rule of 6 as well. So in a lore sense, the rule of 6 seems to be a Pokemon League implemented rule as part of an orderly, lawful setup to encourage respectful battling. It's not explicitly spoken about, but I imagine if anyone was caught using more than 6 to win a battle, they would perhaps be punished or disqualified from challenging the League gyms and the Elite Four. Think of it like a UFC or boxing match. It's an organised and regulated way of fighting, whereas a bare-knuckle street fight, a doping violation to give you an edge, or just a literal violent crime are all ways to get short-term power within a moment, but in reality are punishable, have long-term repercussions, and generally people don't do those things in orderly society. So how could this be included in the games? Well, as we established, when chaos ensues in the Pokemon world's pressing times, the rules somewhat go out the window, a bit like martial law, but on a more individual basis rather than through government. So in the game, maybe some less moral characters could do this tactic against you at random, or in boss fights like we saw with Volo. Maybe then you could have the option to sync to their level and to use Pokemon from your PC to get the upper hand. Maybe you could even do this at your whim against other rule-abiding trainers. Each extra Pokemon you use could come at a wider cost. Imagine, for example, you're fighting the champion and you're losing. You get your team of 6 wiped out, but rather than the blackout screen popping up, it gives you an option to choose an extra Pokemon, and then you win the battle. However, the game includes an RPG classic, a respect meter from different characters or institutions. Bending the rules and being immoral might see you gain respect from villainous characters that you've met. Let's say Giovanni, for example, who values domination at all costs. This might open opportunities up for you in the criminal underworld. However, you'd be banned from fighting in the league until you redeem yourself, or raise that respect meter to a certain level. RPGs like Fallout and Skyrim, which have more emphasis on the player choosing their destiny, have this mechanic, and have done for a long time, where characters remember your actions and think of you in certain ways reputationally. And this does have repercussions, but also presents new opportunities. I know this is a million miles away from Pokemon's family-friendly, path of the hero vibe, but if Pokemon really want to go full RPG and give us meaningful choices that impact our story, beyond just which clan do you want want to pick and which starter. Perhaps they could create a new spin-off that trials this sort of path choosing mechanic, or they could include it in future Legends games. Maybe the increased age rating in ZA is a sign of things to come in the future. I have plenty more cool gimmick ideas that I think could end up in the Pokemon series that I'd love to share in a future video. So if you enjoyed this video, leave a comment with your thoughts on what gimmick you'd like to see in Gen 10, and let me know if you'd want a part 2. Until next time, love you gang.